and welcome back to Colorado Politicking. I'm Pat Poblete, a legislative reporter, and joining me this week, as always, is the Capitol's ever-present Colorado Politics chief legislative reporter, Marianne Goodland. And this week, as a special guest, we have Colorado Politics resident data man, investigative reporter, Evan Wyloge. Ladies and gentlemen, how are we doing?
Good.
End of the week, yay.
So, Evan, I want to start off with you because we got some big news at the federal level in terms of census data that has some pretty significant impacts on Colorado. So I'm just going to kick it to you. Take it away. Tell us what this means.
Sure. So this week, the U.S. Census Bureau released some of their work product from the 2020 decennial census. And that's a process where they try to count every single house and get a totally precise count for states, counties, etc. This week, what they announced is the state populations down to the person, and then what that corresponds to in terms of adding or subtracting political representation. And that happens in a couple of different ways. First, we are going to get a new congressional seat. So we're going to be bumped up from 7 to 8 congressional districts. And there are some other states that lost a congressional district. The other thing that happens is this changes the formula when it comes to the electoral college. And so they will be adding and subtracting from that sort of the voting numbers for each state based on the population. So Colorado is one of a handful of states that will be getting one more congressional seat in DC this upcoming cycle, starting in 2022, and this will last through the rest of the decade until they do the next decennial census.
And from big news at the federal level, let's move to big news at the state level. And Marianne, just this Thursday, we got news that the General Assembly is going to be moving some legislation on guns. What can you tell us about that?
This is a package of 3 bills that Democrats in the legislature are planning to introduce either Thursday, could be Friday. The first one repeals a state law that forbids local governments, and that's cities or counties, from passing stricter gun laws than what the state offers. In Boulder, for example, 10 days before the King Soopers shooting, a Boulder District Court judge tossed out a resolution passed by Boulder City Council that banned assault weapons. So this would allow them to go back and redo that resolution. The second is to set up something known as the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and they will be collecting data and making recommendations on public policy regarding gun violence. The third, and I think this is the one that's going to be the more controversial, is on background checks. And for those who've been around a while, in 2013 we had a batch of gun safety bills, one of which was on background checks, and that led to the recall of 2 Democratic state lawmakers. This one would add violent misdemeanors to the list of things for which you cannot buy a gun or transfer a gun. We haven't seen what those violent misdemeanors are yet, but that's coming. The second does something known as closing the Charleston loophole. This refers to the 2015 shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, where a shooter killed 9 African Americans at a church. And what happened was that he went through the background check process, but because the background check information didn't come back in 3 days, and that's exactly the same law that Colorado has, he was allowed to come in and pick up his gun and off he went. So that also is going to be addressed here. The other big news of the week is a bill on collective bargaining that House Majority Leader Dene Esgar of Pueblo is going to introduce. And this would allow every single public employee, and this applies to adjuncts at community colleges and county and city and special district employees, you name it. If you're a public employee, you would have the right to get into a union and engage in collective bargaining. And this is a bill that is making civic leaders pretty unhappy. It hasn't been introduced yet, but we do expect it sometime in the next week. Now, Pat, you also had a pretty big scoop this week regarding climate change.
Yeah, Marianne, and this had to do with SB 200, which is probably the big climate change measure this year that's seeking to kind of build on the state's landmark climate action plan that was passed in 2019. Now, this is another really wide-ranging measure. So the top-level overview on the contentious bit is that it adds some enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the state reaches the climate goals that were set out 2 years ago. Now, those were a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2025, at least a 50% reduction by 2030, and a 90% reduction by 2050 based on 2005 levels. Now, it would do this essentially by making the Air Quality Control Commission what bill sponsor Faith Winter referred to as the program manager, and it would set sector by sector limits on emissions. Now, as you can imagine, the bill has some opponents, and perhaps chief among them is Governor Jared Polis. And now we've known that for a while. We've known he's against the bill. He sent a member of his administration to come testify against it when it was up in an initial committee last week. What we didn't know, though, is the extent to which he opposes it. Now, he sat down earlier this week with the Gazette editorial board and kind of unprompted was highly critical of this bill, to the point where the editorial board asked him, "Are you willing to veto this?" And we'll go ahead and let you guys have a listen to his response.
Yeah, I mean, I am, not willing to give the dictatorial authority over our economy to one unelected board that lacks the broader mandate and expertise. I think that we have a plan to be able to continue to clean our air, reduce carbon emissions.
Now, that plan that we heard Polis mention at the end there is really where the issues are with Democratic lawmakers. They say that the roadmap, so to speak, that Polis unveiled is too aspirational. During that hearing I talked about last week, Democratic Senator Kerry Donovan compared it to letters to Santa Claus. Essentially, what Democrats here in the General Assembly think is that there need to be enforcement mechanisms to make this work. And it's probably also worth mentioning that one day after those comments from Polis, this bill was up before another Senate committee, and it passed out of that committee on the back of Democratic votes. And it's also probably worth listening to what Faith Winter had to say about this bill as it was up for a vote. So we'll play a quick clip of audio from her as well.
So this isn't changing anything, it's enforcing. And to enforce rules and make rules something more than hopes and dreams and wishes and press releases, we need to make sure that we're meeting them. And that's what we're doing.
Now, guys, this will certainly be one to watch as it continues to move through the legislative process. It has cleared 2 committees in the Senate. It has 1 more to go before it goes to the full Senate for deliberation. So we'll go ahead and keep you guys updated on that as it moves through the process. But I believe that's all we have time for this week. So for Evan, for Marianne, I'm Pat Poblete. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and we will see you next week.